The wind whispered over the plains like an old song half forgotten, brushing through the dry stalks of grass that had turned brittle under the unyielding sun. The horizon burned a pale gold, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. On the edge of that restless land stood a cabin of rough timber, its roof patched with tin and hope. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, curling into the sky in gentle spirals, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Inside, the air was heavier, thick with quiet pain. The rancher lay on a cot, thin as the driftwood that had washed up along the riverbanks, coughing through nights that grew colder with every passing hour. His hands, veined and knotted with years of labor, rested against the faded quilt, trembling slightly from the effort of holding himself upright. The room smelled of cedar, earth, and the faint, metallic tang of his illness. His eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, now flickered like dying embers, tracing the shadows that moved across the rough walls. Beside him, on a small wooden table scarred with decades of use, sat a glass bottle. It was nearly empty, containing the last remnants of medicine he had been saving, a medicine that could have given him weeks, perhaps months, to linger on this land. He gazed at it with a quiet deliberation, the weight of his decision pressing down like the unbending sun on the prairie. And then there was a sound, a soft shuffle outside the cabin door. He stiffened, listening. A girl emerged from the dawn like a fragile shadow, her skin pale against the dust of the trail, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Her clothes hung in tatters, patched and worn, but her presence carried a quiet resilience, the kind that had weathered storms he could not imagine. She had wandered near the ranch, drawn perhaps by instinct, perhaps by chance, or perhaps by the whispered promise of sanctuary she could not name. She collapsed on the edge of the porch, coughing, her hand pressed to her stomach, trembling. He watched her for a long moment. His own pain throbbed in his chest, but something in the girl's eyes stirred something older, buried. Responsibility. Compassion. A flicker of the man he had been before the years of dust and loneliness had carved him into a shape of rough edges. The cabin smelled of cedar and dust, the walls creaking softly as the morning stretched itself awake. He moved slowly, each step a negotiation with his own failing strength, and fetched the medicine bottle. He poured a small measure into a tin cup and handed it to her without a word. She took it with hands that shook, fingers brushing his knuckles, and drank. There was no speech, no gesture of gratitude, only the quiet acknowledgement of life given, of time borrowed, of survival shared. Outside, the prairie held its breath, and for a moment, the world was reduced to the space between them. Two beings fragile and strong, bound by circumstance, bound by the invisible thread of mercy. He remembered his own youth in decades past, when he had been full of anger and pride, when he had refused to help others because he feared weakness. And now, lying half-broken on the edge of the world, he understood the subtle power of kindness, how it could ripple beyond the measure of what one could see. The girl drank slowly, eyes closed, drawing warmth into her chest. He wondered how long she had been walking, how many miles her body had carried grief, fear, and hunger. Even as he thought this, the weight of his illness pressed heavier. His cough rattled in his chest like the slow, insistent tolling of a bell. Fever flushed his face, and he felt the edges of the room blur, the walls breathing with him. Yet he did not regret his choice. In that small act, he had glimpsed something larger than himself, something worth leaving behind. The girl rested near the fire, curled into herself as though the world outside had nothing to offer her anymore. He watched her and felt a strange kinship, a sense of quiet understanding passing between them. In another life, perhaps they would have spoken, laughed, or argued. But here, in this fragile moment of survival, words were unnecessary. The language of mercy was enough. Memories crept in unbidden. A lost horse, a neighbor's child who had fallen ill, a friend buried beneath the relentless sun. Every moment of kindness he had withheld pressed against him, and he realized that the measure of a man was not in the land he owned, the cattle he tended, or the miles he had ridden. It was in the quiet acts that left no mark but changed the course of another's life. The sun climbed higher, burning through the thin wooden walls, casting long stripes of light across the floor. Dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the golden beams, and the girl stirred, blinking slowly at the brightness. She did not speak. She only offered a faint smile, a soft acknowledgement of life sustained. It was enough. Hours passed in the slow rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, an ocean of gold and brown, whispering secrets that only those who listened could understand. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dry soil, and somewhere distant, a hawk cried, circling against the endless sky. As night approached, the rancher lay back, feeling the exhaustion press him down like a blanket of stone. He thought of the girl, and a quiet warmth bloomed in his chest, fragile and delicate as the first spring bloom after a harsh winter. Perhaps this was what he had been waiting for all along. Not the prolonging of his own life, but the chance to give something that mattered, something pure and untainted by regret. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, throwing shadows that danced like old ghosts on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it a faint, sorrowful song of the plains. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wrap around him, and drifted into a sleep that was deep and untroubled, if brief. Somewhere in the night, the girl stirred, her breath steady now, her hand brushing the floor as she tested her strength. She would survive, he thought. She must. And in that thought, there was a peace he had not known in years. The bottle sat empty on the table, a silent testament to the choice he had made. Life had a way of balancing itself, he realized, in ways unseen and often misunderstood. Perhaps the medicine had given her more than just a chance to live. Perhaps it had given them both a small redemption, a fleeting proof that even in the harshest, driest corners of the world, kindness could take root. The prairie outside the cabin whispered through the night, carrying the sound of distant coyotes and the rustle of dry grass. It was an old song, one of endings and beginnings intertwined, and for the first time in many years, the rancher felt that he belonged to it. Not because he had tamed the land, not because he had survived the sun and wind, but because he had chosen to act from the heart, even when it demanded more than he had to give. And in that quiet understanding, the night held them both, a dying man and a fragile girl, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing the fragile, unspoken threads of life that connected all who walked the plains under the vast, indifferent sky. The wind rose again, carrying with it a promise that life, even in its most delicate forms, would find a way. And for the first time in many years, the rancher allowed himself to believe in that promise. Morning broke like a whispered secret over the plains. Light spilled through the cracks in the cabin walls, soft and hesitant, painting stripes across the floor. Dust danced in golden ribbons, caught in the quiet heat of dawn. The rancher stirred, coughing into the faded quilt, and for a moment feared the night had been nothing but a dream. But there she was, the girl, still curled near the fire, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, her hair a dark halo against the worn rug. She had not left. That simple truth struck him deeper than any medicine ever could. She had chosen to stay, though the journey ahead was uncertain, though the path outside promised nothing but dust and loneliness. And in her presence, the cabin felt warmer, safer, less like a tomb and more like a fragile cradle for the living. They moved together through the morning with quiet ritual. He carried water from the small tin basin, while she stirred the coals, coaxing them to life with soft patience. No words were exchanged at first. Their lives communicated through the rhythm of shared tasks. The clink of tin cups, the sigh of settling boards, the faint hiss of boiling water, all became a language that required no explanation. The rancher observed her carefully. Her hands were small but calloused, marked by survival. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the room as if measuring its safety, its boundaries, its willingness to accept her. There was a dignity in her weariness, a strength beneath the fragility, and he realized that though the world had tried to break her, she had endured. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying whispers from the prairie, tales of travelers, coyotes, and storms that never arrived. Yet not all the eyes that watched were kind. A neighbor, the ranch hand who had known the rancher for years, appeared at the edge of the property. His boots crunched the dry grass, and the sharp look in his eyes cut like a blade. He had noticed the girl the night before and had drawn his own conclusions. Suspicion shadowed his face, suspicion tinted with fear of what he did not understand. "Who's she?" he asked, voice rough like gravel sliding over stone. No greeting, no warmth, only the blunt edge of accusation. "She needed help," the rancher said, voice low, almost a whisper. The words carried more weight than a shouted argument. There was no room for debate. The man grunted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, eyes lingering on the girl as if trying to read a story written in invisible ink. She did not flinch. She looked at him, steady and unbroken, as if her gaze alone could ward off judgment. After a long pause, he tipped his hat slightly and retreated, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. But the suspicion lingered, an invisible thread stretching across the morning. The girl began to move more confidently around the cabin. She chopped firewood, swept the floor, and even managed to prepare a thin soup of corn and dried herbs. Each motion was deliberate, careful, and slow, as if she measured every action against the rhythm of survival itself. The rancher watched, marveling silently at her quiet competence. As the day stretched on, her story unfolded, not in dramatic bursts, but in small, tender fragments. She spoke of her people with a soft reverence, of a tribe that had once embraced her and then cast her aside when illness marked her as fragile. She spoke not with bitterness, but with sorrow, a mourning for what had been lost and a hope for what might still be found. The rancher listened, a silent witness to the unfolding of a life that had been overlooked, dismissed, yet never truly broken. He began to see not the girl who had collapsed at his doorstep, but a survivor whose spirit had weathered storms far greater than any wind or sun could throw at the plains. Evening fell like a velvet curtain, soft and heavy. Shadows stretched across the cabin, draping the room in muted tones of amber and gray. The rancher's illness pressed upon him with renewed insistence, each breath a reminder of the fragile thread that held life together. But the girl's presence offered a quiet balm, a rhythm of care that neither demanded nor expected, only existed in the natural cadence of companionship. A traveling preacher passed by the property, pausing at the fence. His eyes were gentle, though distant, and he offered a nod and a quiet prayer. No words of advice, no judgment, only recognition of the lives unfolding within the cabin. The rancher nodded back, not out of piety, but out of acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, had noticed the silent struggle, the unspoken acts of care. Night deepened. The prairie was alive with sound. The distant call of coyotes, the rustle of grasses, the low hum of insects. The girl sat near the fire, gazing into its heart, as if drawing strength from the flickering flames. The rancher joined her, leaning heavily against the wall, his body aching but his spirit touched by the small miracle of her presence. "Why stay?" he finally asked, voice barely more than a whisper, breaking the quiet like a fragile twig. She looked at him, and in her eyes was a depth that spoke of roads walked alone, of hunger endured, of fear faced and survived. "Because," she said softly, "you helped me. That's enough reason." No further explanation came. The words hung between them, light and unshakable. It was not an act of romance, not yet. It was the quiet recognition that someone had seen her, had chosen her survival over convenience, over his own comfort. That recognition was profound, a gentle anchor in the storm of her life. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of rain. Somewhere beyond the hills, the first hint of a storm whispered across the plains, a prelude to change that neither of them could yet see. The rancher's cough broke the silence, ragged and wet. The girl moved to his side, not speaking, only offering water, warmth, a steady hand. Her strength, though quiet, seemed to fill the room, a counterbalance to his weakening body. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, the drums began, a distant, measured rhythm that seemed to rise from the heart of the land itself. It was neither threatening nor friendly, simply a call, an echo of something ancient. The girl paused, listening. Her eyes reflected the firelight and something older, recognition, hope, and the faintest tremor of anticipation. "I know someone," she said, voice hushed. "A healer, a shaman. He listens to the land. He knows things we cannot." The rancher turned his head slowly, curiosity mingling with fatigue. "And he would help us?" She shook her head. "He cannot promise, but he can guide." The night pressed in around them, heavy yet tender, a world softened by firelight, wind, and shared presence. They were two souls adrift in the vast expanse of the prairie, yet anchored to each other by something unspoken, unseen, yet undeniably strong. And in that quiet, fragile world, the rancher felt a stirring of hope, as delicate and persistent as the first star blinking awake above the endless horizon. Somewhere deep in the prairie, the drums continued, a faint heartbeat that would follow them into the days ahead, a prelude to the arrival of the one who could see not only what was broken, but what was brave, strong, and alive. The cabin held its breath with them, the fire softened, the wind whispered, and the world, for a moment, was full of quiet possibility. Dawn arrived, soft and muted, as if the world itself had held its breath for the night's secrets. The prairie was pale with mist, the long grass bending gently beneath the weight of dew. The rancher lay on his cot, body heavier than the hills beyond the cabin, eyes half closed, yet a restless awareness tugged at the edges of his fading consciousness. Somewhere outside, the girl stirred quietly, tending the small fire, listening to the wind as though it whispered something only she could understand. And then he came, a figure moving through the mist, steady and calm. Not a rider thundering across the plain, nor a man shouting claims and demands. Just a presence that seemed to belong to the land itself. The shaman, clothed in muted tones of earth and shadow, approached the cabin with the rhythm of the wind in the tall grass. His eyes, deep and still, reflected not the surface of a world, but its undercurrent, the hidden flow of life, loss, and mercy. The girl stepped back, hands lightly touching the rim of the fire, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The rancher, too weak to rise, felt something shift in the room, an acknowledgement without words, a recognition that this was no ordinary visitor. The shaman paused at the threshold, nodded faintly, and entered without ceremony. He knelt beside the rancher, not speaking immediately. His hands hovered above the cot, fingers tracing shapes only he could see. The rancher felt a warmth, subtle and insistent, not from fire or medicine, but from a quiet, unspoken understanding. Time seemed to slow, the minutes folding in on themselves, as if the prairie outside had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Finally, the shaman spoke, voice low and flowing, like the soft currents of a hidden stream. He spoke of balance and debt, of giving and receiving, of kindness carried beyond the measure of sight. He did not prescribe remedies. He did not scold. He merely reminded the man of the paths he had walked, the choices he had made, and the lives he had touched. The rancher listened, breath shallow but attentive. He understood, not with the mind, but with something deeper, older, a part of him that had long been buried beneath calluses and regret. The medicine, he realized, had not been the cure. The choice, the act itself, had shifted the balance. The girl's life had given his own meaning once more, even as he lay broken and spent. The girl watched, her hands folded in her lap, eyes reflecting both awe and relief. The shaman turned to her then, eyes steady and unjudging. He saw her not as fragile, not as broken, but as brave, as strong in ways the prairie itself had taught her. No words were needed. In his gaze, she felt the quiet truth of recognition. She belonged. Together, the three existed in a space where the ordinary laws of life and death seemed suspended. Herbs were prepared, their fragrance subtle but insistent, filling the room with earthy warmth. Rituals followed, soft and deliberate. Each movement a dialogue with the unseen, each breath a bridge between suffering and hope. There was no grand spectacle, no miraculous cure flashed in a blaze of light. Healing was a slow, intimate process, measured not in hours, but in the patient unfolding of spirit and body. The rancher felt the fever ebb, not instantly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability, like the soft retreat of morning fog. His breath came steadier, chest rising and falling without the harsh interruptions of the previous nights. Strength returned gradually, a fragile tendril winding through his limbs, reminding him that he had not yet finished with this world. Even as his body healed, the bond between the three deepened. The girl moved more freely now, assisting with the herbs, learning the rituals, her hands steady as they traced the shaman's instructions. There was trust here, earned through patience and care, not demanded or forced. And the rancher, weakened yet aware, began to feel a quiet love that had nothing to do with desire, nothing to do with ownership. It was love as recognition, as respect, as shared survival. Outside, the prairie seemed to hum with approval. The wind softened, carrying the scent of sage and wet earth, and distant birds traced lazy arcs through the sky. The world, indifferent and vast, had somehow shifted its weight to accommodate the fragile peace that had grown inside the cabin. The neighbor ranch hand passed by again, slower this time, his suspicion tempered by something he could not name. He glimpsed the smoke rising, the steady shape of the girl working, and the faint outline of the shaman kneeling by the rancher. No words were exchanged, only a quiet acknowledgement that some things could not be judged by simple eyes. Some things required seeing with the heart. Night came again, deeper and more serene than before. The fire burned low, the cabin steeped in warmth and quiet. The rancher lay back, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of the girl's breathing, the soft hum of the shaman's chant. And for the first time in many years, he felt that he had been seen, not for his work, his land, or his years, but for his choices, his small acts of mercy, his willingness to act when it counted most. The girl leaned against the cot, hands brushing lightly across the quilt, and the rancher felt a faint reassurance ripple through him. In her presence, in this shared space of healing, he understood that survival was never a solitary act. It was a thread woven through connection, care, and the courage to act without expectation. The shaman's voice rose softly, chanting in a language older than the hills themselves. The words carried no immediate meaning, yet their effect was undeniable. They settled into the bones of the rancher and the girl, into the timbers of the cabin, into the restless air of the prairie. By the time the chant ended, the room felt lighter, the burdens of sickness and fear tempered by something invisible, yet powerful. Sometimes, the shaman said, voice barely more than a breath, what heals is not what is given, but what is understood. Not what is taken, but what is chosen. You, both of you, have chosen well. The girl looked up, eyes glimmering in the firelight. We only survived. No, the shaman said gently. You have lived, and to live is to be brave enough to give, to see, to trust. That is the greatest healing of all. The rancher felt tears sting at the corners of his eyes. Not tears of weakness, but of release. Years of pride, fear, and solitude seemed to lift, swept away by a current too gentle to notice, yet too strong to resist. In the quiet that followed, he felt the prairie itself breathe with him, the land stretching endlessly beyond the cabin walls, echoing the rhythm of mercy and recognition. The girl placed her hand lightly on his arm, and the rancher felt the warmth of human kindness like a tide flooding through his chest. He understood that the world could be cruel, and yet here, In this fragile cabin on the edge of the plains, he had glimpsed its capacity for grace. The shaman prepared to leave at first light, his presence already beginning to fade like a shadow at noon. Yet the lessons remained. The rancher's body was stronger, the girl's spirit steadier, and a quiet certainty settled into the room like dust in the sun. He had survived, not because of medicine or skill, but because he had acted with a heart willing to give when it hurt most. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, gold and brown under the rising sun, a vast testament to time, endurance, and the subtle miracles that unfold quietly, unseen. The rancher rose slowly, leaning on the cot, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, aware of the fragile beauty of life reclaimed. And for the first time in many years, he smiled. Not loudly, not with triumph, but with a quiet recognition that he had been seen, understood, and given a chance to begin again. The morning broke with a hush, the kind that stretches across the prairie before the wind has begun to move. Sunlight spilled in thin, warm shafts through the cabin windows, painting the dust in gold and amber. The rancher stirred, eyes opening to a world softer, somehow lighter than the night before. He breathed slowly, fully, feeling strength return in the careful rhythm of muscle and bone. The fever that had gripped him for weeks had loosened its hold, leaving only quiet aches and a sense of fragile renewal. Near the fire, the girl stirred as well. Her eyes were clear, her body steadier, her presence a calm certainty that filled the cabin more fully than any heat or light. She looked at him, and he realized that the bond between them had grown beyond survival. It was no longer merely about life preserved, but about life recognized, shared, and honored. The shaman had stayed through the first hours of dawn, moving with quiet grace among the herbs and fire, guiding without command, teaching without instruction. But now he rose, gathering his cloak of muted earth tones, a figure poised between the world of humans and the rhythms of the land. He turned to the rancher, hands outstretched briefly in blessing. "The land remembers what we give it," he said, voice low and steady, carrying the weight of all the hills, rivers, and wind that had shaped the plains. Every act of mercy, every moment of courage, every choice to see and honor another life, it lives here in the soil, in the air, in the water, and the land returns what it remembers. The rancher listened, absorbing the truth with a heart that had once been hardened by isolation. He had given the last of his medicine to the girl, an act that could have shortened his life, and yet somehow it had opened a space for healing far greater than he had imagined. He understood, finally, that survival alone was not the measure of a life. What mattered was the grace with which it was lived. The girl stepped forward, brushing her hands over the quilt, touching the fire with careful fingers. "I am strong because of your choice," she said softly, voice almost lost in the quiet hum of morning. "And I will stay, not because I must, but because I am welcome." The rancher nodded, a simple movement, yet it carried more weight than any declaration. Here, in this fragile cabin on the edge of the world, he had discovered something he had thought lost forever, a capacity for trust, for care, for connection. The girl was no longer a stranger, and he was no longer merely a man isolated by circumstance and pride. Together, they formed a fragile community of two, bound by the quiet power of selfless choice. Outside, the prairie seemed to respond. The wind lifted the tall grasses into waves that shimmered in gold and green. Birds traced lazy arcs across the sky. The land itself seemed to acknowledge the shift, the balance restored by deeds unseen and hearts willing to act when it mattered most. The neighbor ranch hand passed again, slower this time, eyes softened by understanding he could not name. He glimpsed the smoke rising from the cabin, the steady shape of the girl tending the fire, and the figure of the rancher standing taller, steadier. Words were unnecessary. Respect had quietly replaced suspicion. In the stillness, the rancher realized that his life, once measured in isolation and survival alone, had become something richer, more enduring. He had been given a second chance, not simply to live, but to live with purpose, with recognition, with love that demanded no romance, only presence and honor. The shaman stepped toward the door, pausing to place his hand lightly on the rancher's shoulder. "Remember," he said, "the act of giving, even when it costs you, is never wasted. The world sees, the land remembers, and life answers in its own way." With that, he left, moving back into the prairie, becoming one with the wind and mist, leaving behind only the memory of his calm, steady presence. The girl and the rancher remained by the fire, their eyes tracing the shifting light across the cabin walls. No words were needed. They had witnessed the quiet miracle of survival transformed into understanding. The rancher had been healed, not by medicine alone, but by courage, empathy, and the simple act of seeing another human being's worth. In the days that followed, the rancher began to open his land. A small cabin for travelers, a place to rest for the lost, the weak, and the weary. Word spread slowly through the town and the neighboring prairie. Here was a man who had learned the measure of life, who had chosen to give when it mattered most. And people came, not with fanfare or expectation, but seeking the quiet strength that flowed from the rancher and the girl who had stayed. The prairie itself seemed to celebrate the transformation. Grass grew taller, greener, more resilient. Streams ran clearer, carrying the reflection of sky and sun to all who looked. Life, both human and wild, moved with renewed rhythm, a reminder that the choices of a few could ripple outward, reshaping even the vast and indifferent plains. One evening, the rancher and the girl sat on the porch, the horizon melting into shades of fire and dusk. The wind carried faint drumming from distant hills, an echo of something ancient and persistent. They watched in silence, sharing the quiet intimacy of survival and recognition, the kind of bond that does not need words to define it. The rancher spoke softly, voice carrying the weight of gratitude and newfound wisdom. "I see now," he said. "It was never the medicine that mattered. It was the choice to act, even when it cost me." The girl nodded, her eyes reflecting both firelight and hope. And it was enough. It was always enough. As night settled over the prairie, the stars emerging like scattered embers, the rancher and the girl felt the land breathe around them, steady and eternal. The story of survival, of courage, of quiet mercy had become theirs and yet belonged to all who walked under the endless sky. And for the audience, for anyone listening, for anyone watching in the quiet corners of their own lives, remember this. Sometimes what saves us is not what we hold for ourselves, but what we are brave enough to give away. Life remembers the mercy, the courage, the small acts that seem insignificant until they ripple through the world. And in that remembrance, there is healing, there is hope, there is a life fully lived. So if this story touched you, let it stay with you. Share your thoughts, like the video, subscribe for more tales whispered from the past, and tell us, from where in the world are you watching tonight? The cabin stood quiet now, smoke curling from the chimney in slow spirals. The rancher leaned back, the girl beside him, and the land, wide and golden, breathed gently under the endless sky. A new chapter had begun, one written not in loud triumphs, but in quiet acts of kindness, courage, and shared humanity. And in that, the plains themselves seemed to nod in approval, whispering a secret the wind had always known. Life remembers, and life rewards those who act from the heart.